In 1911, Chicago, USA, Anna and Clara Merrick, identical 6-year-old twins with plaited auburn hair and spotless pinafores, were found inside a public library annex, whispering in perfect synchrony about a fire that had not yet happened, naming the victims, time, and exact location in chilling detail. The librarian, unsettled by the precision, contacted city officials, triggering a quiet but persistent inquiry. Though the girls' home on South Green Street appeared orderly, neighbors noted they never played with other children and often spoke in strange, archaic terms. School records from the Wabash Avenue District School showed Anna had drawn floor plans of an unfamiliar house labeled Ours in a town they had never visited, while Clara described the Sunday basement in language suggesting an industrial slaughterhouse. Between 1906 and 1916, Chicago was a city of booming population, brutal stockyards, and an education system obsessed with standardization. But as early as May 1908, the Bureau of Child Hygiene logged 17 physician referrals, citing verifiable dual memory symptoms. Why did the Department of Public Health seal the case files under federal order in 1917? By 1911, the Merrick twins were considered unusually bright by their teachers, often praised for their composure, diction, and encyclopedic recall, though they spoke in unison and blinked rarely. But a parent's complaint filed on March 2, 1912, mentioned that Clara had drawn a row of corpses labeled "Before We Died," leading the superintendent to request psychiatric evaluation, setting into motion a chain of suppressed investigations. On the morning of March 6, 1911, the headmistress of Wabash Avenue District School, Miss Edna Turley, documented an occurrence that would later be redacted from public records. Her journal entry, preserved only in a personal notebook later retrieved by her niece in 1954, described an unshakable chill upon entering the twins' classroom. A sharp scent of burnt paper hung in the air, though no source was found, and both Anna and Clara Merrick stood silently at their desks, hands clasped, watching her with identical expressions of expectation. The school's heating system had malfunctioned that week, and a constant clanking echoed through the radiators. Dust sifted from ceiling vents, catching the weak sunlight and hovering like ash. During morning recitation, Miss Turley noticed that while other children fumbled with the Lord's Prayer, Anna and Clara recited it in Latin. When gently corrected, they looked at her without embarrassment, as if she had misunderstood something basic. That same week, a custodial report submitted by William Callahan, janitor of the school for 17 years, noted unusual graffiti inside the girls' lavatory. Names and dates, all in red chalk, some smeared. He described the handwriting as too mature for a child's hand. One name, Lucretia H. was later linked to an undocumented house fire in Cicero in 1897, though no official records from the Chicago Fire Department could be found in the municipal archive. Miss Turley, cautious but concerned, wrote to the Bureau of Child Hygiene on March 11th. Her letter outlined a pattern, repeated references by the Merrick twins to events, people, and places beyond their educational exposure and familial context. She underlined, with ink now faded to brown, a sentence that would later be heavily cited by independent investigators. The Merrick family lived in a narrow brick duplex on South Green Street. They do not learn these things, a stretch caught between the industrial rail corridor and recently cleared lots for the expanding Burlington freight yard. The house itself was kept with care, curtains drawn tightly, and a single rose bush in a wooden barrel outside the door. Henry Merrick, the girl's father, was a typist for the railway post office. His schedule was regimented, his clothes impeccably pressed. Neighbors described him as polite but distant. His wife Cora was almost never seen, and the twins were walked to school by a hired girl named Sylvia, aged 14, who refused to speak to adults unless directly addressed. Mrs. Thelma Grunewald, who lived 2 doors down, recalled in a 1918 affidavit that there was always a sound of whispering if you walked past that house after dark. She also described an incident from February 1911 in which Clara stood on the front step facing the street, hands at her sides, whispering tick, tick, tick for nearly 20 minutes without moving. "I went up to ask if she was all right," Mrs. Grunewald wrote, "and she turned to me and said, 'We were in the basement. We watched them go black.'" When asked who she meant, Clara smiled and stepped back inside. By April, Miss Turley had received a response from the Bureau. a single-page form requesting the twins' birth certificates, vaccination records, and school performance reports. No instructions or follow-up were included. Frustrated, she began documenting the twins' behavior more rigorously. On April 19th, during composition hour, Anna wrote a description of our house in Newark. The paper included a sketch of a large 3-story home with a widow's walk and gas lamps. There was no Newark listed in their family history, and her vocabulary exceeded grade level. Terms like balustrade, cistern, and parlor vestibule raised immediate concern. That same week, Reverend Milton Yarrow, who oversaw the neighborhood's children's Bible study sessions, made a discreet inquiry to the school board. According to meeting minutes dated April 25th, he reported that the twins refused to recite Psalms and instead offered passages from an unfamiliar text. They quote a book I cannot identify, he said, in rhythms not of scripture but of confession. One sensory pattern became clear by late spring. A faint metallic scent seemed to follow the twins into enclosed spaces. The school nurse, Mrs. Bernadine Hall, noted it during lice inspections. She described it as not blood but like wet iron. She also observed a symmetrical patch of skin discoloration on each girl's upper back, oval-shaped, slightly raised, and fading as summer approached. Attempts to question the girls were met with flat replies. We had them before. In May, the Bureau of Child Hygiene dispatched Dr. Elijah Fenwick, a physician known for his methodical reports and discretion. His clinical visit was unannounced and lasted under 30 minutes. His resulting note, preserved in a carbon copy discovered in the National Archives, was vague. Subject S exhibit high verbal acuity and shared cognitive overlap. No immediate signs of distress or neglect. Recommend no further action. But behind closed doors, the school board had already voted to flag the twins for observation. Superintendent Amos Layton arranged for a phonograph recording of their next oral presentation, a practice not yet standard in schools. The recording, dated June 2, 1911, is believed lost. However, a transcription exists, taken by the court stenographer present during the session. It contains the following passage. We watched from under the stairs. The lady in the striped skirt called for the boy, but he had no more tongue. The cellar was warm and full of rope smells. Then the black smoke pushed her face away. No teacher present could recall assigning a fictional prompt that day. The summer heat arrived early in 1911, and the air in the city turned thick with the odor of boiling tar and horse sweat. School let out in late June, and for 2 months, the Merrick twins were rarely seen outdoors. But on July 12th, a sanitation inspector named Bernard Krause entered their home by request, citing a neighborhood complaint of chemical stench. His report, filed and stamped by the Department of Sanitation, noted a sharp odor like formalin emanating from the cellar, which was padlocked. Mr. Merrick claimed it was for storage of preserves. The inspector's notes state that Clara stood at the top of the basement stairs throughout the inspection, unmoving, eyes fixed on the wall. He ended his visit without citation, but wrote privately in a margin, no jars, no shelves, no dust. On August 3rd, a page torn from a girl's journal appeared pinned to the schoolhouse door with a sewing needle. It contained no name, but the handwriting matched Anna's schoolwork. The single entry read, "We used to be 3. The small one stayed. Her hair is still there, behind the stone. That's why we wake up thirsty." The page was removed and stored in a locked drawer by Miss Turley. It was never officially filed. By late August, Superintendent Layton requested a joint psychological assessment of Anna and Clara by Dr. Henry Pohl, an associate of the State Mental Hygiene Committee. His session took place in the school's empty library on a humid Saturday morning. According to Pohl's surviving notes, both girls were lucid, articulate, and unafraid, responding to his questions with what he called identical alternating cadence. He asked them to describe their earliest memory. Anna replied, "We wore velvet." He said, "Walk faster." Clara added, "Then the wood floor was warm and red. It soaked through our shoes." Pohl's final remark reads, "Recommend immediate institutional referral pending parent consent. Unusual coordination of memory states. Subjects may have shared identity fixation. No referral was ever submitted. On the first day of the autumn term, September 5, 1911, Miss Turley noticed that Anna and Clara entered the school building ahead of the others. They stood just inside the vestibule, facing one another without speaking. Rain had soaked their coats and water dripped steadily from their cuffs, forming twin pools on the tile floor. When approached, they turned in perfect unison and walked to their classroom without making eye contact with anyone. Inside room 3B, something had shifted. Desks were slightly out of place. Chalkboards had strange partial diagrams on them. One appeared to be a staircase descending into darkness. Another, a crude human silhouette with "missing" written beside it in chalk. Only one eraser was found, damp and smudged with red crayon. No one had keys but the school custodian, who denied any knowledge of the markings. Yet Miss Turley, unsettled, spent the lunch hour washing every board herself. During handwriting period that afternoon, Clara refused to pick up her pencil. Instead, she pressed her palms flat on the desk and stared at her reflection in the inkwell. Her breath fogged the surface. Miss Turley knelt beside her and asked softly what she was doing. Clara replied, "She comes when we forget." "So we mustn't forget." When prompted to explain, Clara whispered, "Her name was Jilly." No such name existed on the school register. On September 13th, another schoolchild, Lyle Farber, aged 8, reported that Anna had approached him on the playground and asked if he remembered when the water came up through the floor. When he replied no, she touched his forehead and said, "You were first to go black." He began crying and refused to return to school the following day. His mother, Mrs. Judith Farber, submitted a written complaint and withdrew him permanently by month's end. The incident triggered a parent-teacher meeting held in the Assembly Hall. Notes from the meeting, later recovered from the Board of Education archive, documented rising concern. Multiple families had reported similar unsettling statements by the twins. One father claimed Clara had drawn a picture of a railway station labeled Departure 1885, with children in matching cloaks lined up in rows. Another mother described Anna sketching a doll in an iron cage with the note, "Her voice wouldn't end." Despite the discomfort, no formal action was taken. Superintendent Layton insisted there was insufficient cause for intervention. By early October, a peculiar auditory phenomenon began to draw attention. During silent reading time, a low clicking sound could be heard emanating from the twins' shared desk. Miss Turley approached on multiple occasions and found their hands resting flat on the surface, fingers unmoving. But the sound continued rhythmically, as if a pendulum ticked behind the wood. She checked beneath the desk, behind the legs, even removed the inkwell. Nothing explained it. On October 9th, she recorded the ticking in her own notebook, notating the frequency and duration. Each occurrence lasted exactly 12 minutes and ceased the moment the girls were separated. That same week, the janitor, William Callahan, discovered a set of small handprints on the inside of the school's attic window. The attic had been sealed since 1904 due to structural instability. The prints were oily, smudged with something like soot, and arranged in a pattern, 12 rows of 2, evenly spaced. Callahan reported the finding to Miss Turley, who insisted on viewing them herself. Together, they ascended the narrow staircase. The attic air was stale, thick with the scent of dry rot and old glue. The window, facing west, was untouched from the outside. No ladder marks, no tampering. The handprints were clean, recent. Yet neither Anna nor Clara showed signs of having been in the attic, and no footprints were found on the dusty floor. October 17th brought the return of Dr. Henry Pole, this time without official request. He had come on his own time, according to his later deposition. He asked to observe the twins in a group setting. During the observation, he placed a box of colored tiles on the table and invited all the students to recreate a house from memory. The twins declined. Instead, they arranged the tiles in a spiral pattern, then reversed it tile by tile in silence, without looking at each other. Dr. Pole asked if they had played that game before. Anna said, "We did it when the wall was red." Clara added, "And we had to wait in the dumbwaiter." Dr. Pole concluded the session early. Later that afternoon, Miss Turley found a note tucked inside the chalk tray of the blackboard. The handwriting was neither of the twins nor her own. It read, "We still remember she is in the grating." She placed the note in her personal file, then locked the classroom for the night. At home, the Merrick residents began drawing attention for different reasons. A postman reported that mail was no longer collected from the front box. Deliveries from the butcher remained unclaimed on the step for hours. Neighbors noted the curtains never opened. On October 23rd, Mrs. Thelma Grunewald testified to seeing the twins walking in circles in their back garden at dawn, barefoot, dragging a length of red twine between them. Each circle was smaller than the last. She called out, but they did not respond. When she approached the fence, they stopped moving and stared. They were waiting for something, she later told an investigator, but not from here. On October 31st, during the school's modest All Hallows' Eve observation, a few candles, some autumn leaves, no costumes allowed, Anna refused to enter the assembly room. When asked why, she whispered to Sylvia, the housemaid, "This is where they took her shoes." That night, Miss Turley remained late to grade papers and found a child-sized pair of black shoes resting on her desk, damp and muddy. She stored them in the supply cabinet. The next morning, they were gone. In early November, City Census Officer Harold C. Digby arrived at the Merrick home as part of a routine urban housing reassessment. His logbook entry notes, "Family of 4. 2 minors. Refused entry. Odor consistent with disinfectant or medical compound. Front parlor blocked by draped sheet. No sunlight inside." He attempted a follow-up visit, but found the house dark and silent. The census file was marked complete with no action required. Back at the school, the twins began producing identical compositions in class, same words, same order, same phrasing, despite being seated apart. In one such assignment, they described a room with grey stone walls and chains above the doorframe. They called it the cold room and noted she couldn't leave because her feet were wrong. A second-grade reading level could not account for the vocabulary used. On November 17th, Clara collapsed during recess. Her body went rigid, eyes open, unblinking. She whispered one word repeatedly, "Ashfield." The school nurse recorded the episode and sent her home. When asked later what Ashfield meant, Anna replied, "It's where we burned, but only some of us." Miss Turley, now deeply alarmed, requested the intervention of Reverend Yarrow. He agreed to conduct a private discussion with the twins on neutral ground. The meeting took place in the rectory office of St. Aloysius Church on November 24th. The girls were seated across from him, hands folded. When asked if they were hiding something, Clara said, "Only what no one asked." Anna followed with, "We don't belong to this name." Reverend Yarrow concluded the conversation prematurely. His final note reads, "They speak without lying, but not with innocence. There is knowledge here no child should have." On December 2, 1911, Reverend Milton Yarrow submitted a sealed letter to the Diocese of Chicago requesting an internal spiritual audit of the Wabash Avenue District School. Though the term was vague, the effect was immediate. 2 clerical representatives were dispatched to observe classroom behavior and report back to the Office of Parish Education. The visitors, Father Eugene Colville and Sister Agnes Marin, arrived without notice during morning prayers. They found the students orderly, attentive, and quiet, except for Anna and Clara, who sat with their hands crossed over their mouths. When Sister Agnes asked why, Clara lowered her hands and said, "It keeps her quiet when we do this." Later that day, Father Colville interviewed Miss Turley privately in the faculty lounge. The fire in the cast-iron stove crackled as she spoke, unflinching about the previous months. Her voice was dry, her hands cold from nerves. She slid across the table a folder containing samples of the twins' writing. He reviewed them silently. Upon reaching the composition titled, "What I Saw Before I Was Anna," his expression shifted. In his notes, found decades later in a diocesan storage box, he wrote, "Chronological distortions suggest a fixed narrative identity older than the child. Possible trauma origin, though unexplained." The next day, Sister Agnes entered the twins' classroom during silent reading and requested that Anna and Clara accompany her for a drawing session in the chapel's anteroom. Inside the dim chamber, lit only by winter-grey daylight, she handed them each a piece of heavy parchment and charcoal. "Draw anything you like," she said. Anna looked up and asked, "Can we draw what we remember?" Clara added, "Not from here." Sister Agnes nodded, unsure of what to expect. 20 minutes later, the girls handed her their sheets. Anna's showed a brick tunnel filled with small beds. Each bed contained a face without eyes. Clara's was simpler, a staircase descending into a black archway with a single word written across the steps. Again. Sister Agnes folded both pages without comment and placed them into her case. That case and the drawings were never located again. Word of the case began to circulate beyond religious channels. On December 10th, journalist Charles E. Lawman, a contributor to the Chicago Sunday Tribune, received an anonymous envelope containing copies of 2 school compositions by the Merrick twins, both describing our family before the change. The handwriting was childish, but the narrative mature, references to the inventory room, the registry mistake, and the name that wasn't ours. Lawman brought the material to his editor, who dismissed it as a hoax. Unconvinced, Lawman began his own investigation. He started with the census records and quickly ran into inconsistencies. The 1910 federal census listed Anna and Clara Merrick, aged 5, living with Henry and Cora Merrick on South Green Street. But earlier census data from 1900 showed no record of a Henry or Cora Merrick residing in Cook County. Birth certificates for the twins, requested from the Department of Vital Records, arrived heavily redacted. Entire sections, including attending physician and place of birth, were blacked out. Lawman filed a formal inquiry. Within 2 weeks, he received a cease correspondence notice, citing unwarranted scrutiny of sealed minors' records. He visited the Merrick residence on December 22nd. The house was dark at midday, with all curtains drawn and the faint odor of kerosene in the air. He knocked 3 times. No answer. As he turned to leave, he saw Clara watching from the second-floor window. She raised one finger to her lips, then slowly closed the curtain. By January, the school board faced mounting pressure. An unsigned letter, reportedly penned by a fellow educator, accused the administration of harboring unstudied psychological anomalies and demanded external review. Superintendent Amos Layton, under quiet duress, contacted the Illinois State Board of Education, requesting an advisory consultation. In response, Dr. Walter S. Reimer, an educational psychologist from Evanston, was assigned to the case. Dr. Reimer arrived on January 9, 1912. He wore a brown overcoat, rimless glasses, and carried a leather satchel filled with sensory tests, drawing prompts, and phonograph cylinders. He insisted on conducting his sessions on school grounds, behind closed doors. Over 4 days, he observed the twins during various activities, spelling bees, arithmetic drills, mealtime, and recess. His report, now housed in a restricted university archive, revealed internal contradictions. He wrote, "The subjects exhibit coordinated behaviors that surpass twin mimicry. Memory sequences not only align, but predate birth context. They answer simultaneously, yet not always with the same content. One remembers what the other forgets." He conducted a shadowing test in which each girl was asked separately to recount a fictional dream. Anna described being trapped inside a house with 12 rooms, none of which had windows. Clara described unlocking the 12th door, finding Anna asleep, and telling her it was time. When the results were shown to Miss Turley, she wept. On January 13th, Miss Turley was found unconscious in the supply room. A pile of shredded paper and broken chalk surrounded her. The janitor found her just before dawn, lying curled beside the filing cabinet. Upon waking, she was disoriented and unable to speak for several hours. She was placed on indefinite leave and never returned to the school. Her final written note, a half-finished letter to the board, ended mid-sentence. "There are things we should not have allowed them to." The interim teacher, Mrs. Helen Carmichael, described the twins' presence as not disruptive but utterly displacing. She noticed that when both girls were present, classroom noise dropped by nearly half. No one raised their voice. The room felt colder. One morning, while reviewing spelling tests, she found a folded sheet tucked between pages. It contained no schoolwork, just a list of names and numbers. Many were crossed out. One name, Mrs. Turley, was circled twice. That same week, Sylvia, the 14-year-old housemaid employed by the Merricks, disappeared. The disappearance was not immediately reported. Only after Sylvia's mother, who worked as a cleaner in Bridgeport, came searching did questions arise. The Merricks claimed Sylvia had returned to live with her family, but Mrs. Fay Ginter insisted she had not seen her daughter in over 10 days. The police were contacted. An initial inquiry was opened but closed within 72 hours due to lack of suspicious circumstance. An anonymous caller reached Charles Lorman on January 18th, claiming to have seen a girl's shoes floating in the canal near Darman Avenue. Lorman went to investigate but found only ice and refuse. He published a brief item in the Sunday Tribune titled "Vanished Domestic and the Twins Who Speak in Time," but the piece was pulled after a single day in print. Evidence continued to disappear. The census irregularities noted by Lorman were quietly amended in official records. Pages once missing reappeared with clean typing and new dates. When Lorman returned to the Department of Vital Records to verify the redacted birth certificates, he found both listed as standard entries. The black ink that once obscured details was gone. The entries now cited St. Elizabeth's Hospital as place of birth. The problem? St. Elizabeth's did not admit maternity cases in 1905 or 1906. When questioned, the clerk on duty claimed the hospital had temporarily expanded services, yet no such documentation exists. On January 24th, Sister Agnes Maran resigned from the diocese. Her formal reason: irreconcilable breach in confidence and mission. She left the city within the week and was never contacted again. In the final days of January, Father Colville returned to the school, this time not as an observer but as a man searching for closure. He entered the classroom during midday recess and sat at Anna and Clara's desk. He closed his eyes. Later, he would write in a private letter to the Archbishop, "There is a presence in this place that cannot be reconciled with faith or reason. It is not what they are that terrifies me. It is what they remember." On February 2, 1912, an unsigned envelope was delivered to the office of the Illinois State Board of Health. Inside were 3 black and white photographs printed on brittle cellulose paper. Each photo showed the same location from a different angle: a narrow stone-walled corridor lined with low metal beds. One image included a child-sized figure lying prone beneath a thin woolen blanket. No identifying marks existed on the photos. No return address, but tucked behind them was a brief note on folded stationery. They remember because they were not meant to leave. Within 48 hours, the envelope was rerouted to the Bureau of Child Hygiene, where it vanished from the official intake log. No copy of its contents appeared in internal memos or casework, but Dr. Elijah Fenwick, the Bureau's earlier field examiner, who had briefly evaluated Anna and Clara, returned to Chicago from Springfield unannounced 3 days later. He carried no formal assignment, only a personal notebook and an outdated state inspector's badge. Dr. Fenwick visited the Wabash Avenue District School on February 6th under the pretense of conducting a facilities inspection. The building had not been scheduled for review. Inside, he requested access to the basement, long sealed for repairs after a furnace leak in 1909. The janitor refused, citing safety orders from the city. Fenwick left without protest, but not before briefly speaking with Clara during lunch. She looked up from her sandwich and said, "We were on the 3rd cot." The one they forgot when the carts came. That same day, Charles Lorman received a call from a former hospital orderly named Peter Lang, who had worked at St. Elizabeth's until 1908. Lang had read Lorman's brief article before it was pulled and claimed to remember 2 girls in one crib, brought in during a late-night intake without paperwork. He described a tall man with a dark coat and a leather folder who signed something and then left through the service corridor. Lang remembered the twins' silence most of all. They didn't cry. Not once. Not when we changed them. Not when we took blood. Not even when we put the tubes in. Lorman arranged to meet Lang in person on February 8th, but Lang never arrived. The boarding house where he lived reported that he had left early in the morning with no suitcase, only a folded newspaper in his coat pocket. His room, according to the landlord, smelled of vinegar and old ink. Lorman filed a missing person report. No follow-up was ever recorded. Meanwhile, classroom behavior continued to deteriorate, not through disruption, but through growing unease. Several students requested to be moved to other classes. A few began reporting sleep disturbances. 8-year-old Gerald Hinks told his mother he had dreams of stairs that led to walls and a girl with no name in her mouth. When asked what he meant, he cried and begged not to return. His mother withdrew him the following week. Mrs. Helen Carmichael, the interim teacher, began to keep a personal ledger of daily incidents. In her entry for February 14th, she wrote, "Both girls hummed softly during math instruction. The sound seemed to fill the room, but had no direction. At times it felt like it was behind me, but when I turned, they had not moved." She requested reassignment before the month's end. City officials grew uneasy with the mounting attention. On February 18th, a memo from the Department of Education's legal counsel advised Superintendent Layton to suspend all further documentation of the twins' case. No official conclusions are to be entered into school records. Discussions regarding the Merrick minors must remain oral and confined to personnel meetings. The memo was signed but not archived. Its existence is known only through a carbon copy found decades later in a private legal folder belonging to the superintendent's estate. That same week, Reverend Yarrow held a closed-door meeting with Father Colville, now visibly aged and increasingly agitated. The meeting, recorded unofficially by the church secretary, included Colville's statement, "They carry the memory of another judgment, something unfinished. And something is feeding on the unfinished." When Yarrow asked if he meant possession, Colville replied sharply, "No. Possession is something taken. This was never given back." On February 22nd, a strange entry was made into the school's maintenance log. Clocks reset themselves during night. 4 units advanced by 3 hours, 3 by 5 hours. No entry signs. William Callahan, the janitor, chalked it up to student tampering until he arrived early the next morning and found the clocks advanced again, this time all by 7 hours, synchronized. He locked the hallway cabinets. No further entries were made, but Callahan tendered his resignation within a week. The tipping point came on February 28th. A substitute teacher, Miss Frances Darrow, was assigned temporarily to room 3B. She lasted only 1 day. According to her written statement, she arrived 15 minutes before the start of class and found the twins already inside, standing beside the globe. Anna was spinning it slowly, while Clara whispered numbers. When asked what they were doing, Anna replied, "We're finding the place we never were." Darrow assumed it was a game. But later that morning, while collecting spelling tests, she noticed something peculiar. Each child had written their name in the upper right corner, except Anna and Clara, who had written the same name, Monsieur Bell. When Darrow asked them about it, they denied having done so. She showed them the papers. Anna's eyes filled with tears. Clara simply turned away and said, "She wants to finish the letter." Miss Darrow contacted the principal's office but left before her replacement arrived. Her final note was brief. "There is memory here not belonging to time. I cannot teach over it." The following morning, the school board held an emergency session. The decision was made to request medical intervention under the Illinois Juvenile Observations Act. That evening, an order was signed to have the twins assessed at the Chicago Municipal Children's Hospital. But when 2 attendants arrived at the Merrick home on South Green Street on March 2nd, they found it empty. No furniture, no clothing, no personal effects. The windows were cleaned from the inside. The rose bush in the barrel planter had been uprooted, soil packed flat. The house was entirely silent. A police search was initiated. Over the next 3 days, authorities canvassed train stations, steamer ports, and city hospitals. No trace of the Merrick family was found. Neighbors reported that the family had seemed normal in recent days. One boy recalled seeing Anna and Clara sitting on the stoop 2 days prior, braiding yarn into their hair. "They said they were going somewhere colder," he said. "But they didn't have coats." The school board ordered all records related to the twins placed in sealed archives. Reverend Yarrow resigned from parish leadership and was reassigned to a rural diocese in Iowa. Sister Agnes was never reached for comment. Dr. Reimer submitted his final report anonymously, leaving it on the superintendent's desk without signature. Its final line read, "If memory can persist beyond biology, we must ask what burden it carries and why it returns in children." On March 12th, Charles Lawman received one final letter. The envelope bore no return address and no postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it were the words, "She remembers us too." Beneath, drawn in fine pencil, was a single red shoe. On March 18, 1912, demolition workers began clearing a condemned tenement on the corner of West Cullerton and South Emerald Avenue. The building, an 1870s-era structure of crumbling brick and iron fire escapes, had suffered multiple fires and was scheduled to be torn down for municipal expansion. At approximately 10:45 in the morning, during the removal of a collapsed rear stairwell, a foreman named Jonah Ricks uncovered a narrow sealed passage behind a lathe-covered wall. The air that emerged was dry and sour, with a faint trace of ammoniac decay. Curious but unalarmed, he ordered the workers to break through. The opening revealed a short corridor, no more than 4 feet wide, walled in with soot-darkened stone and lit only by shafts of sunlight from cracks in the crumbling structure. Dust thickened with each footstep. At the end of the passage they found a door. It was wood warped with time and bore no handle, only a bolted eyelet once used for chaining. It took 3 men and a crowbar to pry it loose. What lay beyond it would halt the demolition project indefinitely. Inside was a windowless room roughly 12 by 16 feet, with ceilings no higher than 7. The walls were clad in blackened brick, their seams packed with what appeared to be old plaster and cloth. The floor was uneven, partly covered with rotted linoleum, beneath which a number of low iron cots were lined against the far wall. Each cot had thin leather straps affixed at wrist and ankle points. In the far right corner, beneath a half-collapsed beam, lay an overturned chair and what remained of a small child-sized shoe. Authorities were notified within the hour. By early afternoon, city police, fire marshals, and a representative from the State Board of Health had arrived. Among them was Inspector Nathaniel Hart, a 20-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, known for his reticence and his methodical approach to crime scenes. He entered the room at 2:15 p.m. with a notebook and a wax pencil. His first observation, recorded without embellishment, was no windows, no ventilation, one source of entry, multiple signs of long-term confinement. Beneath the cots, the forensics team uncovered 3 flat wooden boxes, approximately 4 feet long, each nailed shut. The room fell silent as the first box was opened. Inside, wrapped in wax cloth, were tightly stacked folders, medical files each labeled with a numerical code and bearing the faded seal of the Illinois Home for Convalescent Children, a state-funded institution that had been shuttered in 1899. Many of the files were partially burned, but others remained intact, their pages brittle but legible. They contained names, diagnoses, dates of admittance, and, disturbingly, no discharge information. One name appeared repeatedly across the files: M. Bell. The entries spanned from 1893 to 1898. One notation read, "Monsieur Bell, subject unresponsive to standard memory repression therapy, displays signs of linguistic regression and foreign identification, has begun mirroring behavior with new entrants. Isolation recommended." Another box contained personal items, dolls with removed eyes, children's clothing, photographs clipped into folders with handwriting beneath each image. Several showed twins or siblings. One was labeled trial pair, record incomplete. Observation terminated prematurely. It was the third box, however, that caused the lead investigator to halt all excavation and request federal oversight. Inside were 12 jars, each sealed with wax and labeled only with a date. Inside each jar floated what appeared to be samples of brain matter, suspended in formalin. Several contained scraps of paper folded and pressed against the glass. One read, "Failure." Another, more faded, said, "She resisted." The final jar, larger than the others, bore a cloth label stitched with the initials AM and a date, May 1906. Inspector Hart ordered the room sealed. Photographs were taken using magnesium flash, which briefly illuminated the walls with stark, cold light. In that moment, observers noticed something strange. Etched faintly into the brick behind the cots were dozens of repeated phrases, scraped in with what appeared to be a metal fork. The most common was "We remember," followed by the wrong name and "She wouldn't stop calling." News of the discovery spread, but within 48 hours the site was closed under a joint order from the State Department and the Office of Juvenile Health. Reporters who approached the barricades were turned away. One man, a stringer for the Herald, was briefly detained and had his camera confiscated. No official statement was issued. Meanwhile, Dr. Elijah Fenwick managed to access the site using his outdated credentials. He spent 17 minutes inside the room, according to the watch of the patrolman on duty. When he emerged, he refused to speak, handed over a handwritten note to the nearest officer and walked away. The note, later stored with the case files, read, "This is not a place of death. This is where memory was meant to be lost." On March 20th, a clerk in the Bureau of Vital Records named Alva Dinsmore contacted Charles Lorman. He had read about the sealed files discovered during demolition and claimed he had seen matching records during a late-night reorganization the previous year. He invited Lorman to visit discreetly. When the journalist arrived, Dinsmore presented a single birth index card. Clara M. Bell, B. April 29, 1905. Location, N.A. File destroyed. He flipped it over and revealed a stamped remark. Linked to Monsieur Bell. Do not reissue. That same evening, Lorman received a message slipped under his apartment door. It was a small envelope, unmarked, containing a clipping from the Tribune's obituary page, dated May 2, 1906. The name, Marion Bell. Age, 7. No cause of death listed. Service held privately. Beneath the clipping, in neat handwriting, she never left. She just changed names. The next morning, demolition resumed at the site on South Emerald. But when workers arrived, they found the door to the hidden room open. The iron cots had been dismantled and stacked neatly against the far wall. The boxes were gone. Only the etched words remained. The room was cold and smelled faintly of lavender soap and rust. Inspector Hart, upon being informed, went personally to inspect. He remained inside for nearly half an hour. When he exited, he looked pale and unsteady. "Shut it up," he said to the foreman. "Seal it, I don't want it touched again." The crew poured concrete that same day, filling the room in stages. The last thing to disappear beneath the slurry was a single red ribbon, caught on a rusted nail. The site became a vacant lot. Grass did not grow there that spring. That night, after the room was sealed beneath concrete, Inspector Nathaniel Hart returned to the precinct alone and requested access to the property ledger archives. He spent over 4 hours reviewing building permits, ownership records and sanitation logs for the address on South Emerald. At 2:13 a.m., he filed a request for archival retrieval of a disused property name, Ashfield Annex. It had not appeared on any official map since 1898. A clerk on duty noted Hart's request as urgent, handwritten, not signed in ink. The next day, a reply arrived from the Department of Institutional Licensing. It was brief. Ashfield Annex operational from 1892 to 1899. Decommissioned without reassignment. Records classified. Inquiries require federal authorization. The final line had been struck through in pencil, then rewritten more faintly. Annex closed due to custodial discrepancy. By March 24th, unease had begun to circulate among city officials. Rumors swelled that the files discovered beneath the collapsed tenement had not been burned or misplaced, but moved. That certain names, Monsieur Bell, A.M., even Merrick, had appeared in older ledgers from orphan intake registers dated before 1900. That several child pairs listed as discharged were never located again. Journalist Charles Lorman returned to the Merrick home, though it now stood empty and silent behind a padlocked gate. As he stood outside, a neighbor approached, someone who had not spoken during the earlier investigations. An older man with thinning hair and tobacco-stained fingers, he introduced himself only as Josiah, a former night watchman at the freight depot nearby. He said he'd seen the twins the night before they disappeared. They walked down Green Street holding a bundle between them, he said, like they were carrying something asleep. Could have been a doll, but too heavy for that. They never looked back. He told Lorman that when he went to the house the following morning to check if they were home, the door was ajar. Inside smelled like lemon polish and burned sugar. Upstairs the beds were still made, but the closet doors were all open, and in the kitchen someone had wiped the table clean with a damp rag. It was still wet. Lorman asked if he told the police. Josiah shook his head. What would I say? That ghosts cleaned the house. I figured they were taken, or they knew where to go. Later that evening, Lorman received a second visit. This time it was a woman in her 50s, well-dressed but visibly nervous. She introduced herself as Constance Daly, a former nurse at the Illinois Home for Convalescent Children. She said she had worked there during its final year, 1898. She had read a short piece about the discovery on South Emerald before it was pulled from publication. That room, she said, I remember it. We called it the memory cellar. No windows, no light. They said it was therapeutic, that some children needed forgetting. Daly produced a notebook, aged and water-stained, from her coat pocket. Inside were sketches, diagrams of room layouts, and a list of names, some crossed out. She flipped to one page and pointed. Monsieur Bell. They made her sit for weeks, said her memories weren't her own, that she brought others with her. When asked what that meant, Daly's voice dropped. The other children began to repeat her words. She whispered in her sleep. And after a while, even the nurses started dreaming about staircases. Lorman requested to copy the notebook, but Daly refused. It's the only thing I kept, she said. The only thing they didn't burn when they closed us down. She warned him to stop writing about the case. It doesn't end in print, it ends in silence. Despite the warning, Lorman returned to his editor at the Tribune with a full manuscript draft. The editor read it in silence, and then placed it into a drawer. No, he said simply, not this one. When pressed, he added, there are things the city has already decided it doesn't want people asking about. You don't chase the things that survived red ink. Across the city, in a private room at the Municipal Children's Hospital, Dr. Henry Pohl reviewed a microfilm reel of records once marked as destroyed. It had been delivered to him by courier from the Department of Mental Hygiene, unsigned, and with no request for return. The reel contained admission files from the Ashfield Annex, including biometric evaluations, language tests, and compliance observations for dozens of children. One entry stood out, a matched pair, both unnamed. Age, 6, arrival date, unknown. Observations noted, mirror recall unprovoked unison speech contradictory origin narratives. The final line read, subject separated on directive, Monsieur Bell retained. Second female removed by error. Pohl, sweating beneath the hospital's overhead light, rewound the reel 3 times, rechecking dates. The document's margin bore an annotation in red pencil. Merrick? He copied the page onto tissue paper and burned the film after. He did not return to work. By March's end, demolition of the South Emerald site was halted again. Not by order, but by desertion. The remaining crew refused to return. Rumors circulated that one man had broken into the newly poured slab and found it warm to the touch. Another claimed the concrete had begun to crack, revealing a shape like a cradle beneath. Whether true or imagined, all agreed to abandon the site. A month later, city inspectors declared the lot unsuitable for development due to seepage and unexplained subsidence. Grass refused to grow, rain pooled and vanished without drainage. That spring, the city moved on. No official mention was made of Anna or Clara Merrick again. Their school files were destroyed in a fire the following year, one that consumed a section of the Wabash District Board building. Reverend Yarrow never returned from Iowa. Inspector Hart retired suddenly, citing irreconcilable observations. He gave no interviews, but some records remained. In 1915, 3 years after the house on Green Street was vacated, a plumber named Albert Gilsby was hired to inspect drainage in a neighboring duplex. While in the crawl space between foundations, he found a rusted tin box wedged between bricks. Inside were fragments of notebook paper, clearly child-written. One fragment read, "We did not leave. They changed our names. They gave us numbers and took our mouths." Another, faint and smudged, "She stayed. We tried to bring her back. But the wall would not open." The final note, written in a child's hand, was almost illegible, but one word could still be read. Ashfield. By the summer of 1912, public interest in the Merrick twins had dwindled into rumor and unresolved curiosity. With the family vanished, no formal charges were filed, and no legal grounds for arrest remained. The South Emerald property was reclassified as a failed urban lot and quietly omitted from future zoning proposals. It did not appear on city maps printed after 1914. Despite the lack of judicial consequence, internal fallout swept through state and municipal institutions. The Bureau of Child Hygiene underwent sudden restructuring in August. Dr. Elijah Fenwick, who had unofficially re-entered the case, was transferred to an office in Peoria and stripped of field duties. His personal notes, stored in a box marked MISC Anomalies, were locked in storage and never refiled. One memo inside that box, scrawled in pencil and bearing no date, read, "They were not made to forget. They were made to remember something the rest of us are supposed to lose." Superintendent Amos Layton of the Wabash Avenue district was removed from his post in early September. The reason cited was negligence in record-keeping and unsafe maintenance standards. In a closed session, the Board of Education also reviewed an unsigned statement alleging that Layton had falsified inspection reports concerning the structural history of the school. He was never charged with wrongdoing, but his personnel file was sealed, and he died in relative obscurity in 1919. The Illinois State Board of Education adopted a set of amendments in early 1913 aimed at standardizing psychological assessments of minors across all school districts. Quietly included was a clause prohibiting subjective memory narratives from being used in behavioral evaluations. It was a vague insertion, but its presence altered how memory-related anomalies were recorded for decades. Teachers were instructed to report only measurable behavioral phenomena, effectively erasing qualitative experiences like spontaneous speech in unknown languages, dual narratives, or shared imaginary constructs from all official documentation. Journalist Charles Lawman, whose articles had once stirred attention toward the case, left the Tribune by the end of that year. His byline disappeared entirely after a final opinion piece titled "The Inventory of Silence," in which he posed a single question. What does it mean when the state records something it later insists never existed? The piece was retracted hours after publication. Lawman left Chicago and reportedly lived in a small town outside Milwaukee, where he ran a stationery shop and never spoke of the twins again. Of the individuals closest to the case, few remained in public life. Dr. Henry Pohl retired from the State Mental Hygiene Committee and was not seen again. Records show he purchased a cabin in Door County, where neighbors described him as polite but solitary. His cabin was found abandoned in 1920, with all furniture intact and a Bible open to the Book of Ecclesiastes. Written in the margin of the final page, "There are rooms no fire can erase." St. Aloysius Parish, once overseen by Reverend Milton Yarrow, underwent renovations in 1914. The chapel's east anteroom was bricked over due to structural instability, and the old vestry ledgers vanished. Father Colville's private writings, later discovered by a custodian in a forgotten chest, included passages questioning the ethics of memory therapy used in institutional care. In one entry dated only Lent 1913, he wrote, "We believed the past was a burden to be lifted, but perhaps we were lifting something meant to stay buried." The community of South Green Street changed slowly. The duplex that once housed the Merricks was leased to a series of new families, all unaware of its history. The rosebush in the barrel planter did not bloom again, despite multiple replantings. Children on the block claimed the upstairs front window sometimes flickered at night, though no light fixtures were installed there after 1913. In 1916, a visiting insurance inspector noted the odor of old disinfectant in the kitchen and an unusual chill in the pantry, despite working radiators. His report was marked non-hazardous. Some neighbors kept fragments of the story alive through whispered anecdotes and half-finished accounts. Mrs. Thelma Grunwald, who had witnessed the twins' behavior firsthand, died in 1921, leaving behind a locked sewing box. Inside, among threads and thimbles, was a postcard addressed to A&C Merrick wherever you went. The message simply read, "She kept the shoe. I hope you found the other." By the end of the decade, schoolchildren no longer remembered the names Anna or Clara. The name Ashfield had been fully purged from municipal listings. Only in certain state archives, mislabeled or misfiled, did fragments remain. Half pages, burned reports, school compositions copied onto tracing paper. None of it cohesive, none of it complete. In 1920, a real estate surveyor working on behalf of the city rediscovered the South Emerald lot while evaluating potential expansion routes for the elevated rail. His notes were precise and methodical until he reached the last line of the form where he wrote, "Ground resettles faster than expected. Soil soft. Beneath concrete, layers of brick and ash. Cold persists. Recommend no further digging. No construction ever took place. The Illinois Home for Convalescent Children, already decommissioned, was formally delisted from the state record in 1921. Its former grounds were purchased by a private interest group and converted into a fenced orchard. The remaining structures were demolished, their rubble buried under imported soil. A single cornerstone from the original annex building was recovered and placed in the County Historical Society. The engraving read, "Founded in memory, no date." In 1921, a final anonymous donation arrived at the Chicago Board of Education, addressed in childlike handwriting to "The Room Where We Sat." Inside the package was a set of school drawings, identical charcoal sketches of narrow beds, blank faces, and a long hallway without a door. One was signed faintly in red pencil, "We never left." In April 1921, just days before the statute of archival review was set to expire for several closed state institutions, a clerk named Marion Keating, then 26 and recently hired, flagged a mismatched catalogue entry while cross-referencing convalescent homes with decommissioned youth facilities. One card had been misfiled under agricultural development, but its contents described room measurements, patient scheduling, and environmental compliance for a facility known only as Site B. No name, no city. But the supervising officer was listed as Dr. E. Fenwick. Keating filed a request for clarification, expecting it to be dismissed as a clerical error. Instead, she was summoned to the office of the deputy archivist, where she was told in calm and measured terms not to pursue the file further. When she pressed for reasoning, she was told that Site B had been reabsorbed into the state budget under an unrelated category. That evening, the card vanished from its drawer. Keating left the department by summer's end and took work cataloguing mineral samples for the Field Museum. She never spoke of the encounter again. In August of that same year, a retired court typist named Laura Redbridge submitted a privately printed manuscript to 3 local libraries, each titled Parallel Voices, The Bell Sessions. Typed in courier font and bound with cloth ribbon, the document claimed to be a transcript of a suppressed psychological evaluation conducted between 1895 and 1897 involving a child listed only as M. Bell? Redbridge stated in a brief introduction that she had copied the notes from originals she had handled during her time assisting visiting physicians. The transcript was dismissed as fictional by all 3 libraries and rejected from catalogue inclusion, but a single copy was retained in the library basement of the University of Illinois, shelved improperly in the folklore section. Inside were pages describing memory experiments, including forced silence drills, identity withholding protocols, and audio mimicry trials. In one session, the child allegedly spoke aloud a list of names not previously mentioned in the study, some of which would later appear in unrelated patient records dated years after the evaluation. A line from the transcript reads, "When asked how she knew the names, she said, 'Because they didn't bury her the right way, so she comes back through us.'" No record of the study was ever found in the state's official medical archives. In the following years, former staff from the Wabash Avenue District School began to pass away or move elsewhere. Obituaries made no reference to the twins, and most surviving family members had no knowledge of any connection. But in 1926, during the estate clearing of Helen Carmichael, the substitute teacher, who had briefly overseen the twins' classroom, a trunk was found beneath her bed. Inside were lesson plans, test papers, and a sealed envelope marked "For record if anyone still cares." The letter inside was dated March 1912 and addressed to no recipient. It read, "They sat in the middle of the room and changed the sound. That's the best way I can describe it. The very pitch of the place turned when they were near. I believe now they were not being watched. I believe they were watching to see who remembered them." The letter was never sent. The estate manager burned it with the rest of the unsorted documents. Throughout the late 1920s, as Chicago's population ballooned and neighborhoods transformed, the Merrick twins dissolved into urban legend. Children told stories of the Red Girls, who whispered behind school walls and moved in perfect sync. Parents dismissed the tales, but a few older residents of South Green Street still remembered the pale faces in matching coats, the silence, the way they watched rather than played. In 1930, a city sewer project unearthed a segment of hand-laid brickwork beneath the original foundation of the long-demolished Ashfield Annex. Within it, a single iron plaque was recovered, badly corroded. Once cleaned, it revealed a Latin inscription, Memini ergo sum. I remember, therefore I am. The plaque was placed in a Department of Public Works storeroom, logged as decorative artifact, no assigned site. It was never displayed. By 1932, nearly all institutional records linked to Ashfield, the Merrick twins, or Emsbell, had either been destroyed or moved off-site into federal storage. Inquiries were met with polite deflection. Access required permissions that no longer existed. The address on South Emerald was paved over and listed in city plans as a utility easement. Construction crews routinely reported issues with laying pipe, shifting soil, unexplained water flow, or metal obstacles buried in odd grids. No investigation was pursued, but the final known trace emerged far from Chicago. In 1935, a widow named Caroline Ginter, living in Decatur, Illinois, passed away at the age of 71. Among her belongings was a small wooden box containing photographs, lace swatches, and a pressed red ribbon. One photo showed two young girls in profile, faces obscured by glare. The back of the photo read, "We were Anna, we were Clara, we were her voice, not her name." There is no record of how the photo came into her possession. Today, the events surrounding the Merrick twins remain officially undocumented. No criminal case was filed, no institution was censured, no memorial marks the site. The lot remains undeveloped, a square of buckled concrete surrounded by chain-link fencing, perpetually listed as city property pending designation. And in the Chicago Board of Education's archives, beneath a folder labeled Obsolete Student Forms, 1905-1915, a single page remains misfiled. It is blank, except for one line at the bottom, typewritten and off-center. She remembers us still. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.